Everybody, Jesse from Plant the Spear here. Excited to be back in the studio with you guys for a huge game coming up this Saturday. I am pleased to be joined by Norvell Central. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with him. Just excited to talk about the Clemson game with Norvell Central here. Taylor, how you doing, my man? And I appreciate you coming on.
Of course, man, doing very, very well. Super excited about this week. Huge game in front of us, and Mike Norvell always talks about response. How are we going to respond? And we'll kind of discuss that game a little bit later.
Yeah, definitely. And I put out on like my social graphic today. I was like, look, I know every game's big, and anytime you post about a game that's not on Saturday, everybody jumps out. Oh, don't overlook this team and whatnot. And every game's important because it's the next one on the schedule. But this one, to me, was the game that you had circled on the schedule at the beginning of the season. Like I said in the beginning of the season during the preseason stuff, where I think LSU was probably your biggest game, top 10 matchup coming out to open the season. Obviously, Clemson has kind of lost its luster a little bit with the way they've played and the game being at noon. But to me, by far, this is the most important game on the schedule because you just got to get over that Clemson hump. And I mean, they've been on a losing streak to them, which we'll talk about later. But this is such an absolutely massive game, and really just excited to get into it. So I think the first thing we're going to do, and we kind of hinted at this a second ago, everybody is freaking out about some Boston College. So we're going to spend a few minutes just kind of talking about some quick thoughts on the BC game, because I feel like as a fan base, and this is typical of most fan bases, everybody overreacts to a lot of different things. I think people honestly may have overreacted a little bit to the LSU game, where they thought we were 2021 UGA and just going to run through everybody. And then I think people are also really a little too quick to react to this Boston College game. I mean, I can't confirm necessarily that there was the flu bug going around, but we've seen it come out from players' parents and things like that was an issue. And it was just, I think that was a game where you're going to have those every now and then. I put out a thing on social media where you saw Georgia won the national championship last year, but they had a close game against Missouri. And then all the other playoff teams had some close games. So to me, I think it's a bit of an overreaction. There was some things that concern you in that game for sure. I don't want to act like it was nothing, but I don't think it's time to just burn the stadium down and cancel the rest of the season. So share a couple of quick thoughts on that game and why it's not time to panic quite yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's not time to panic, but Mike Norvell alluded to in his press conference, it was a lack of focus, a lack of just drive. You can pinpoint and say, okay, they were focused on Clemson, but just the fact of the matter is, you even saw after that Lawrence to a Philly fumble, they crumbled under pressure. And a lot of times he talks about the word response. How are you going to respond when you get your face planted on the mat? And a lot of times with Thomas Costello, he basically just said that, it's a dual threat quarterback. Defense was having problems with third downs. They went 8 for 19. It was just a problem to get off the field at times. And you thought Florida State had them under wraps with 31-10. Next thing you know, stuff started to snowball. And I'm glad that they were able to face this adversity now because they can grow from it and understand how the processes go with everything. But overall, the team has to focus as they go through because Clemson is a very, very tough environment. And I know that they're going to be ready for this next challenge.
Yeah, and I definitely think, full transparency, I think they got caught looking forward to Clemson. I think they held a couple of starters out, and I don't know this for sure because Florida State doesn't share injury news, but I thought they felt okay with sitting some of the starters. I thought they felt like they could just kind of go up there and run through this team. And you got to give credit to BC. They came to play. And I mean, I really do think now I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Boston College is good. I'm not going to say that. But I think when you look at the NIU loss, they were playing around with the quarterback situation in that game. They really had no consistency there. And then they of course they beat Holy Cross, which is an FCS team, the next week by 7 points. Holy Cross is a really good FCS team. You still shouldn't be in a dogfight as a Power 5 team against an FCS school. But I feel like once they get Castellanos some experience in that offense, BC might be okay. They might win a few games. But they came to play, and we talk about that red bandana game and how important it is to them. And they were ready to go. And frankly, they punched Florida State in the mouth, and Florida State was not ready to respond. But I think it's fortunate that that type of game happened against a team like BC where you can come out and play terrible and still win. But I do think a lot of it was just, like you said, it was lack of focus and a lot of mistakes. I mean, at one point they were up 31-10. They were on a 28-0 run. They scored on 5 out of 6 drives. They had 5 consecutive stops. I mean, they started slow, but then got things rolling before they just let them get back in it. And I just think that a lot of the issues in that game are easily correctable.
Yeah, and I will say this also. I mean, Boston College did have a school record in penalties where they had 18 penalties on the game. I mean, Florida State should have been able to take advantage of that, and they just weren't able to kind of flip the switch and kind of punch them in the mouth, get it over with. Because, I mean, they were in scoring position before they had a turnover on downs there, when they were going up possibly over 38-10 and had to punt the ball away to them at that point. You ended up having a 4th and 2. You had a 5-yard penalty to back you up. Next thing you know, you're having to punt back to them. That kind of started a little bit of a run that probably shouldn't have happened. And if you would win up 38-10, who knows? You probably would have knocked them out, and it would have been 45-10 final score.
Right, and I do agree. And in a weird kind of way, I almost feel like this game might have been good for them at the time that it happened, because I think, like I said something about the Southern Miss game, and I think it might have just been a week late on what I was talking about, where I wanted to see how they responded against Southern Miss, because you had spent the whole week after LSU. Everybody's telling you how good you are. You're top 3 in the nation. You feel like you can just – and I think this is a lot of what happened with Clemson against Duke. You thought you were the more talented team and you could just roll the helmet out. That's a lot of what we saw towards the end of the Jimbo era, where you just had talent. You thought you could just roll the helmet out there and win the game, and it wasn't the case. But I think that this game will in turn help them a little bit, because it's obvious the noise has made it back. I mean, we've seen some things on social media from like Jordan and them where they've said all the negativity has come out. So I really do think it made it back to them. I think they have heard the noise, and I think they're going to come out and play with a chip on their shoulder this week. So this may actually in turn, it was stressful on Saturday, but I think it might end up being maybe a positive in the long run.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think, when you're coming into this week, Clemson's won 7 out of the last ACC championships at this point. They're kind of the team to watch out for, as you could say. I mean, it's kind of at the top. You have to be the champ to beat the champ. You just need to understand what's at stake. And you can't really base your focus all on this game, because while it is important, you can't let it derail the rest of your season. You have Duke, you have Miami, you have Florida on the schedule. You have a lot of teams that can be able to beat you at any given week. And Coach Norvell talked about in the post-game conference. While it is great that they were 1-0, you have to understand that you're going to give teams best shot the rest of the season that you have so far. So it's just really important to understand and hone in and focus on what's kind of at stake here.
Yeah, you can't let this game beat you twice. And I do think that it was a humbling experience. And I do think they'll bounce back, and I do expect them to respond. And just thankfully they had that game, but not this week, because they would have got their doors blown off if you play like that against Clemson. But I do think they'll do better going forward with that extra motivation. But I mean, like you said, you gotta know that every week is going to be a challenge. And a lot of times we see FSU play up to the competition. And I know a lot of people talk about they play down to the competition. Sometimes I feel like they use some games where they're overmatched as a glorified scrimmage. But, they beat a lot of their lesser teams. I mean, they ran them out of the stadium last year. So it was surprising to see that. But, again, the flu thing could be something. I don't want to hang up my hat on something I can't entirely confirm. But, like we were talking about before the show, I've actually come down with a little bit of cold. And I didn't even want to do a podcast yesterday, let alone go play a football game on Saturday. So it definitely presents its challenges. But, now that we kind of buried that a little bit, because everybody's just, it's funny. Everybody thought after the LSU game, we're going to go undefeated and win a national championship. And then after the Boston College game, I can't tell you how many comments I have. Oh, we suck now and this and that. No, they don't. Like, this is the same team that blew out LSU. This is the same team that didn't play great and still ran away from Southern Miss. So I don't think it's time to sound any panic alarms. But we have a huge one on Saturday. So let's turn our focus to Clemson, because this is obviously, like we said, a huge matchup. This is a game that I know I'm going to tell on us a little bit here. We both kind of thought Florida State would lose this game in the preseason. Now, Clemson has had some things where they've fallen out of the top 25. I don't think they're as bad of a team as people make them out to be. They kind of are like Florida State, where they've just been plagued by mistakes. It's just Florida State has been able to overcome them and win, whereas they lost one of the games where they made the most mistakes, and that was against Duke. So we'll start. I have some game notes to start with here. Just because of the hurricane last week, I decided to include this. So on Saturday, it looks absolutely beautiful for football. High of 77, 11% chance of rain. So the weather should not be a factor at all Florida State is a 2.5-point favorite, over under a 56. And it is a noon game, which I know everybody was disappointed in, but I did a little research on this, and I think it definitely favors Florida State. So when you talk about a noon game, Clemson has not lost a home night game since 2013 when Florida State beat them in Death Valley, which is really insane to think about. But when you look at the two noon games that they played last year, one was a 27-21 6-point win against Syracuse, who Florida State beat on the road by 35 points a few weeks later. And then the second one was a loss to South Carolina at the end of the season, which snapped a 40-game home win streak. Florida State is coming off of a noon game on the road, so they kind of got a dress rehearsal for this one. Clemson did have one-day game. I think it was at 2:15. They have not played a noon game yet. So I know the noon game is kind of a disappointment to a lot of people. But overall, I think it's a little bit of an advantage because you don't have to go play in Death Valley at nighttime. So share some of your thoughts about the start time and how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think that's a way that Florida State can kind of get back focused a little bit more. You're not having to play in a hostile night environment. Now, Death Valley is still going to be a tough place to play, of course. They've only lost one home game in the last 6 years, I believe. So it's been quite a bit of an adventure in terms of Florida State. And we talked about it before. Florida State has not beaten Clemson in the last since 2014 at that point. So you really have to hone in, understand what's at stake. And I don't think the noon environment is going to be a time for Florida State to be there. I know the Boston College game was a little bit more weird and just in terms of time frame and the Hurricane Lee coming through and just trying to figure out all the processes there. And you talked about it before with the flu issue. You don't really know what was kind of going on with that. So there was a lot of factors that were going to it. And I believe that Florida State's pretty confident in their abilities to kind of get back on the right track. Because you look at it, the 3 injured players that were out for the Boston College game, they're all practicing now at this point with Robert Scott, Maurice Smith, and also Akeem Dent as well. Those 3 guys are coming back, and they're potentially going to be able to be available to play. So a lot of times when you think about that, that kind of bodes well for Florida State's confidence as we kind of go through. And I think they're really understanding this is a must-win game in terms of just the environment and what it brings to the table as we kick off on the noontime.
Definitely. And I think just getting those players back, I really hope Akeem Dent can go because what we saw from the replacements at the safety position was a concern against Boston College. Yeah. So I think you really need him back for this game. Even though Clemson isn't necessarily like the biggest passing threat, you just want that veteran presence on the back into your defense. So obviously you just named it. The last thing I have on this game, though, Florida State has not won in Death Valley since 2013, and they're currently on a 7-game losing streak. So this is why we say it's so important. Like, you have to get over that hump. And if you can bring in a team that's number 4 in the country against a Clemson team that's out of the top 25, and you can't get over that hump this year, it's like somebody said, if not now, when for Florida State. So now is the time that you got to be able to take this game back. So getting into the Clemson game, looking at their team, I have some team notes here. It's been a little bit of a sloppy start for them. 6 turnovers in the first 3 games. They're only 1 of 4, 25% on field goals. So really mistakes has been what has held them back. Now they still have a 70% blue chip ratio. So this team is loaded with talent. They've only played 1 Power 5 opponent and they lost by 21 points. And I do bring that up because the next point, the stats are somewhat inflated from them playing that really bad FCS team in Charleston Southern, even though the game was pretty close. But I have a couple things where I have their stats and then I have it adjusted for FBS opponents. And it really does tell 2 different stories. So getting into Clemson, we'll first talk about their schedule and some of the thoughts on these games here. So the first game, we obviously know they played Duke. They lost 28-7. Had it not have been for a muff punt, they might have got shut out in that game. But they fumbled the ball. I think it was like 3 times in the red zone, had 2 blocked field goals, just so many mistakes in that game. But what's really interesting for me is when you look at that game, after it was over, some people put out that Duke only has 2 blue chip players on that team. So for you to make that many mistakes but still not be able to win, there was a lot of issues in that game. And what Clemson fans told me after the game when I kind of criticized them a little bit was, well, we outgained them. And so we're fine. We just made mistakes in the red zone. But Clemson ran 19 more plays in that game. So, of course, you outgained them. When you look at the yards per play, Clemson was at 5.88. Duke was at 5.84. And, we don't really know how good Duke is yet because they did beat Clemson. That was a lot of with what Clemson did to themselves in that game. But you also have Duke, who's played Lafayette and Northwestern, who was 1-11 last year. So, to me, we don't know how good they are, but it has to count as a decent win if they already have Duke inside the top 25. So they only had one explosive play in that game. They did not have a single pass completion over 20 yards. They had a 0% contested catch rate on 5 targets in that game. And I know teams are allowed to get better, but Duke had the 105th ranked pass defense in 2022. Another thing that stood out to me was they allowed pressure on 42.6% of their dropbacks, even though Duke only blitzed 25.5% of the time. Duke ran for almost 200 yards in that game and allowed 0 sacks. Now, Riley Leonard is a baller at quarterback there. That had a lot to do with it. But when you see that game and you see them losing to a team like Duke, and that's what was funny to me with Clemson fans, where they were like, well, we made a lot of mistakes. I'm like, we're talking about Duke. You guys have earned the right to be mentioned with Alabama's and Ohio State's and Georgia's of the world, and you're talking about getting blown out by Duke. So just give me some of your thoughts on what your immediate takeaway was when you saw them just get handled by Duke in that game.
Honestly, I thought that there was a way that they could have been able to kind of implement Will Shipley to the offense a little bit more. I thought they kind of went away from it with Klubnik, was struggling a little bit more, trying to fill the void a little bit. But just like we talked about with Florida State and Boston College, when you start trailing a little bit and you're starting to kind of see yourself reeling back a little bit more, I thought that whenever Riley Leonard was playing really well at the quarterback position for Duke, they kind of saw everything kind of transpire as it was, and it just became the Clemson that we really weren't really used to seeing at that time. You're used to seeing the championship DNA that Dabo Swinney has developed there in a culture, and they just didn't really have it that night. I don't know specifically, if they've shot themselves in the foot, they're just trying to find their way back. But as you talked about, I mean, they had 19 more plays at that point. So really, when you're looking at the stats and just the analytics in general, how are you able to kind of bounce back in that? And I get they played 2 easier opponents at this point. They're having to come in against Florida State, trying to find their way back into it in the ACC conversation. But just overall, it's just too many mistakes, and you're just not really used to seeing that out of a Clemson team.
Yeah, I think we saw the word Clemsoning come back for the first time in a long time, and we hadn't seen that. And I do think I watched that game because it was on an off night. I think it was Monday night or something like that. And I sat down and watched that game, and I think a lot of that was what we saw against Boston College and Florida State. I think they came out flat, and Duke just straight punched them in the mouth. I mean, they were hyped. They were ready to go. They had a decent crowd for Duke, but they had a lot of energy in that game, and Clemson just looked like they were there to go through the motions, which is why, in the college game, momentum and energy and that edge, which is like we talked about, Mike Norvell mentioned after the Boston College game, is something you have to bring. So looking at game number 2, this is one that initially I remember we were at the tailgate for Southern Miss when we checked the score and saw it was 24-17 at halftime against Charleston Southern, who was a 2-win FCS team in 2022. And you immediately just go, oh my goodness, what is are they about to have their Jacksonville State game? And they ended up pulling off. They won 66-17. They got it together in the second half. As telling as that 24-17 halftime score was, this game was a just absolute slaughter by Clemson. When you really look at the numbers, I mean, they outgained them by 600 yards. They had 9.33 yards per play. Charleston Southern only had 3.24 yards per play. Charleston Southern had a 1-play touchdown drive after a fumble and a pick 6, which is what really got them in that game. So I don't read too much into that game, but at the same time, that's the one where I talk about you got to look at their stats in 2 different lights, because they just absolutely, killed them in the second half, and it really does make them look a little bit better statistically. But then you move on to game 3, 48-14 against FAU. It was a night game for them. I think it looks like when you look at the snap chart that they really kind of pulled everybody early in that game. I think they knew Florida State's coming to town next. They just kind of wanted to work on a few things. They pushed the ball a little bit down the field more in that game, but 5.94 yards per play, which still they haven't topped 6 yards per play against an FBS team yet. And Florida State has done that in almost every game. And they held FAU to 4.6 points, and FAU is just not really all that good. They had 4 turnovers in that game, including a pick 6. Clemson had a turnover in that game. And like I said, they got into the overall depth chart really early in that one. So just before we get into offense versus defense, let's just talk about some overall thoughts on where we feel Clemson is at right now. Because to me, I think mistakes have been the story of their season. And as you see them go from game 1 to game 2 to game 3, they've started to clean things up. The penalties, the turnovers, they're still there, but they've gotten better. Now it's been against bad competition. So I think when Florida State comes to town, they haven't seen anything remotely close. Even Duke, who's playing well, They haven't seen anything remotely close to what Florida State's going to bring to town. So I think this game is going to be semi-close because they're better than maybe they look on paper, which actually they probably look better on paper with the blue chip ratio and whatnot. But, you look at the 6 turnovers, you look at the penalties, you look at the field goal things, and everybody pushed them out of the top 25 and said, oh, they're done. And I'm sure Dabo's using that as motivation. So I'm kind of glad Florida State laid an egg, but still won against Boston College. So maybe we can use that as some motivation too. But just give me some of your overall thoughts on Clemson, and what do you feel they are truly like versus just what everybody thinks they're terrible now. And I don't think that's the case. I really don't.
I think they're a really good team. I just think, like you said, mistakes have been just kind of the red flag for them at some points. And I do think that they have some really good offensive pieces, not only Shipley, but I do think Antonio Williams is a guy that I think Florida State's going to have to watch out for. You saw him on that go route with Kevin Noles on a late third down there. Unfortunately, he was able to get the huge touchdown there. South Carolina native, Florida State recruited him for quite some time. Unfortunately, he went and stayed home. But just kind of looking at their offense in general, I think they're very, very consistent in what they bring to the table. Defensively, they don't get as much pressure as they used to. They only have 4 sacks on the season, but they do generate some takeaways on the defensive side of the ball with their defensive backs. But just overall, I think that this team is capable of making that turnaround, but they just have to be more disciplined. And I never would have thought that from a Clemson team, especially a Dabo Swinney-led team, that they're just so inconsistent in terms of just mindset and focus. Maybe one day they'll kind of get back to that rate, and maybe that might be a game against Florida State that kind of pulls it all together. But they desperately need this win in terms of kind of turning around the perception of that program as of late.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why I think this game is so big for both teams. I mean, the weight is kind of on Florida State's shoulders. You are expected to take the ACC back this year. You are expected, now that you blew out LSU, to go compete for the playoffs. But nothing would get Clemson's season right like knocking off a top 5 Florida State team. And I'm sure they're probably feeling confident that they can do it because of the win streak that they have. They are at home. If this game was in Doak, I would probably pick Florida State going away. But you do have to go up there. It's still a really tough place to play. And like you said, the mistakes have been the narrative of that team so far this season. And, after the Duke game, I had some back and forth with some Clemson fans. And I said, man, just because it's game 1 doesn't mean those mistakes are going to get cleaned up. And they have showed up in game 2 and then in game 3. And I was like, look, we watched Willie Taggart coach our team. We know mistakes don't always get fixed. But I still think they have some deficiencies. I think they are not the same team that they were in the 2018 years and things like that when they had the title runs. Now, looking at some more advanced stats, because I understand that everybody was ready to leave Adam Fuller in Boston after this past week because Florida State has the 101st ranked total defense, which, guys, total defense doesn't really mean anything. That's just your yardage allowed. And when you get into garbage time games or your style of play, like that really doesn't make a whole lot of difference there. You need the scoring defense is what matters, especially when you play a bend don't break style defense like they do. But looking at the S&P Plus comparison for these two teams, which are more advanced stats, opponent and pace of play adjusted, Florida State comes in at 13th overall. Clemson is 16th. On offense, Florida State is 8th. Clemson is 26th. On defense, Florida State's 23rd. And Clemson is 7th. So really, these teams are so evenly matched. It's kind of crazy. Now, Florida State in the S&P rankings have played the 11th, 84th, and 113th ranked team. Clemson has played 30th, 91st, and an unranked FCS team. So these teams are really a lot more comparable when you look at it. But Florida State has obviously played a tougher schedule. So we'll go ahead and start talking about these two offenses. We'll kind of do an offense and a defense, and then we'll talk about the quarterbacks as well. So looking at the offense here, Florida State is currently averaging 47.3 points per game. Clemson is at 40.3. Again, keep in mind the competition that both teams have played. Florida State has 19 explosive plays. That's of 20 yards or more on the season. Clemson only down at 10, and that's really the one thing that stands out about their offense to me. They just cannot seem to generate too many explosive plays. And I know a lot of the people from Clemson, they told me that, well, those explosive – I literally had someone tell me explosive plays don't matter if you can get first downs. They do matter. Like, they totally matter. And It was something that we talked about in the LSU preview was that if you get behind, say Florida State jumps out quick and you're up 10, 20 points, how are you going to catch up when you can't throw the ball down the field? You cannot generate explosive plays. And that's something that's really stood out to me about that offense. Now, continuing down the line, third down offense, Florida State's at 42.9%. You can see Clemson's at 48.7. Red zone, Florida State's doing good there, 100% on scoring trips in the red zone. Offense for Clemson, not doing so great, 68.4%, but a lot of that has to do with them and their field goal struggles. Shout out Ryan Fitzgerald, got things going this year. I don't want to jinx anything, so knock on wood there. Pressures and sacks allowed. Florida State's allowed 24 pressures so far this season and only 1 sack, which is considering you played against LSU. Clemson, on the other hand, this is something I thought they would have one of the better offensive line units in the ACC. Not really the case this year. They've allowed 38 pressures, only 2 sacks, because Klubnik is a mobile guy. He's not anything like you saw in Jaden Daniels or Thomas Castellanos, but he can move. I mean, his pressure to sack ratio is pretty low. But they've allowed a lot of pressure, and I think that's somewhere that can be a mismatch in this game, because to me, when you look at Klubnik, this stems back to the Orange Bowl last year. If you can get pressure on him, if you can rattle him, this is only his 4th start. He is prone to make mistakes whenever he is under pressure and when you get him rattled. So I think Florida State being able to get pressure in this game is going to be one of the biggest mismatches as well. So the 2 offenses, obviously you're going to give the edge here to Florida State. But just give me some thoughts here. We're going to talk about the quarterbacks in a second. I have some slides that we'll put up there. But I think the wide receivers haven't really been all that great when you look at Clemson. You know, they have 8 drop passes this season. They're 7 of 20, only 35% on contested catches. Bo Collins leads with 197 receiving yards, but 137 of that came against Charleston Southern. He only had 50 yards versus Duke. Antonio Williams is in second at 145 yards, but 64 of that came against Charleston Southern. So they really feasted on a bad Charleston Southern team. You know, and then we'll talk some more about some other different position groups. But give me your thoughts on just this Clemson offense and what you're seeing from them. Obviously, they still have Will Shipley. He's still good. But give me some overall thoughts on this offense, and then I have some more stats we'll throw out after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Shipley kind of runs the boat with that offense. I know Klubnik is, like we discussed before, is a really, really good quarterback. He's just got to stay a little bit more consistent with Collins being there. Williams, as I discussed earlier, with being a little bit more shifty slot receiver. I really like Brown. I think he's going to be an up-and-coming freshman. They really like on that team. I definitely think he can kind of take the next step forward in terms of that. Randall's another guy they really like also. There's a lot of weapons on this team, and I understand that the pressure rates for their offensive line is not great. 38 pressures is a ton in terms of just pressure rates and everything, and what Jared Verse can finally do to get over that hump, I think can really be beneficial for Florida State as we try to beat Clemson for the first time since 2014 at that point. So really, when you're looking at this offense, I definitely don't think it's some pedestrian offense that just doesn't been able to move the ball, but I do think they have some weaknesses that you can be able to exploit in certain aspects.
Yeah, because when you look at the missed field goals and then you look at all the turnovers they've had in the red zone, I think the Duke game, they fumbled like twice on inside the 5-yard line. So that does drag their offense down a little bit. And Klubnik, this is why, if you guys watched the preseason preview we did, where we talked about, I thought it was beneficial for Florida State to get Clemson early in the season. Klubnik still finding his way to get in rhythm in this new offense. But when you look at their leading tight end, only has 43 yards and a touchdown, and that's a guy, Brenningstool, that they thought would be, a big target for them. He's a big guy. But when you look at the struggles to push the ball down the field, that's really what stands out in this offense. 68.5% of their passes have been under 10 yards. And for reference, Florida State is at 47.6%. Only 10 passing attempts over 20 yards, and 4 of them came against FAU. Keep in mind, you can air it out all you want against a team like Charleston Southern, and they just didn't. So now I think Florida State does force the ball down the field a little bit more than they should. That's something we saw in the Boston College game. We need to learn to take those underneath routes. Now, when you look at Clemson, you also talk about the offensive line, which we mentioned. They're allowing 32.8% of their dropbacks have pressure. Florida State's at 26.1. So I think this is a game where, like you said, Jared Verse can have a get-right game where he can be impactful in this game. And Cade Klubnik, and we're going to talk about the quarterbacks here in just a second because it's the most important position, so I want to go in depth on them a little bit. But he's been fumble prone too, so if you can have a mismatch there. Now, looking at the running backs, we talked about Shipley, how good they are. Maffa's another running back who's good for them too. He's kind of their power and speed back there. But they average 217 yards per game on the ground right now, which is 15th. But when you look at FBS only, and this is what I talked about earlier, when you adjust for that FCS game, that drops to 141 yards per game. So that's a really big drop. Shipley is at 6.3 yards per carry. Maffa's at 6.8 yards per carry. And Klubnik is at 4.5 yards per carry. But again, Florida State's defense has gotten better against the run. we've just been killed by mobile quarterbacks. And while Klubnik can run, he's not a mobile guy like we've seen in the past, because when you look at what they did against running backs, these are not quarterback rushing stats. These are running backs only. LSU had 49 yards by their backs in that game. Southern Miss had 117 total, but I did some math on that by going through the drive charts. They had about 31 yards from their running backs when FSU pulled the starters, and BC only managed 57 yards. We know Shipley, he had 21 yards last year against Florida State. That's really what killed you in that game. So I do feel like Florida State's been good at bottling up the run, except for against the quarterbacks. Now, tell me, do you think they're going to be able, with an improved defensive line, you think they're going to be able to stop Shipley enough to get this thing done?
I mean, you have to really think about it too. Lovett did not play, extensive minutes or anything in the game. I mean, that was a huge part in being able to have Joshua Farmer out there to have that meaningful playing time. And unfortunately, Florida State really wasn't able to protect up the middle, kind of control the line of scrimmage at that point. And you saw Will Shipley had that 36-yard run there at the end to kind of seal it, after Florida State kind of made a valiant effort at the end to kind of keep it closer than what it expected to be. But just overall, I think Florida State can be able to do that, because I think Braden Fisk does bring a bit of that edge to the line of scrimmage that you actually need in this. Dennis Briggs is another guy that's kind of a hybrid defensive end / defensive tackle that you can be able to use in the middle as well. Very experienced. I think Florida State's defensive line does match up better this season than it did last year, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And out of the 369 total yards that Florida State has allowed on the ground this season, only 160 has come to non-quarterbacks. So to me, as long as you can try, and to me, this is, if I'm Florida State, I'm going to make Klubnik beat me with his arm. And it's not that he's not a good quarterback, because I think he is. He's just young and he's finding his way. Yep. But I don't know that he has the receivers to really go out and beat you. Now, the interesting thing about Clemson too, and we're going to talk about quarterbacks right now, but last year you saw they had DJ, and then when he struggled, they go to Klubnik. This year it's Klubnik, and that's pretty much it. They have a couple of guys that played against FAU, Hunter Helms, but they don't really have anybody behind him. So if he struggles or if he goes down for any reason, Clemson's in dire straits. And that's something that I don't think gets talked about very much this year, is they just don't have any depth at quarterback. But looking at the two starters here, let's go ahead and compare them. And they're actually relatively close now. When you look at Klubnik, he does have a little bit higher completion percentage than Jordan, but obviously keep in mind they throw the ball a lot shorter. When you look at the yards per attempt, 6.5 compared to Jordan at 8.7. Both have 8 touchdowns. Klubnik's thrown 1 extra interception here. Big time throw rate, which is more kind of drop it in a bucket downfield type of throws, only 2.7, which was not that great for Klubnik. Looking at his turnover worthy play rate, which is something, and his big time throw rate against Duke was 0%. Of course, we know they didn't have any explosive plays. We mentioned that, but the turnover worthy play rate here is at 4.2%. which when you use a similar sample size, that was the 9th highest among Power 5 quarterbacks, 19th overall. So if you can take advantage of it, he's prone to some turnovers. QBR, not that great, 43.4, 95th in the country. Jordan's at 87.9, which is 7th. 2 sacks for Clemson, 1 for FSU. His pressure to sack ratio is only 5.3%. So like we said, if you get in the backfield, it's hard to get him down. It was 10% against Duke, so a little higher there. And then, pass grades, we won't talk too much about that because PFF's really let me down, man. Their stats have become crazy. But talking about pushing the ball down the field, this is another one that I think is big here. When you look at them, like we talked about, they don't push the ball down the field. So over 20-yard passes, under 10% of their offense, only 112 yards and 2 touchdowns. They throw the ball behind the line a lot. They do a lot of short passing here. So to me, it's Florida State just really needs to work on keeping everything in front of them in this game because they like to dink and dunk. And a lot of his 2 interceptions came in the short passing range, that kind of short to mid passing range. So I feel like if Florida State can jump some routes, maybe they can get some turnovers. But like we talked about, I don't think he's a bad quarterback by any means. I just think he's young and he's finding his way. And like we talked about, again, credit to Duke, but you have not faced a defense like this. Even when you look at Tennessee last year and North Carolina, the game he played in last year, they don't really play defense. And so it's going to be a little bit of a different world for him in this game when you have guys like Jared Verse, Josh Farmer, Fabian Lovett, Fisk, and all those guys coming at you full speed. And then you also have a good linebacker group and you also have a good secondary too. So just, kind of give some of your thoughts on how you see that matchup going between, can Florida State rattle him and get him to make those mistakes?
Yeah, I definitely think it's time for Jared Verse to wake up and kind of get back to his old self, I think, at some point. Because, the consistency's been there. He has been able to get pressures this season, but he just hasn't been able to generate and get to the quarterback. And I think that's very important there. We talked about Patrick Payton and his kind of running mate at the defensive end position on the other side. He's not really been able to get to the quarterback much either. So a lot of times when you're looking at both of those guys and they're wanting to be more consistent, it's not like Florida State has a ton of depth at the defensive end position. Gilbert Edmond is a solid piece, and also Byron Turner is as well, but they're not Jared Verse and they're not Patrick Payton at the end of the day. So they really have to bring a statement to this game just in terms of perception, what they bring to the table. I think Florida State's defense has to be able to generate pressure because he is getting the ball out very, very quickly. It's not having to go downfield at that point. So Florida State's going to have to do a really good job of being able to contain him, being able to keep him in the pocket, not able to get him those short crossing routes that he likes to do, slants, and just trying to make sure that he is uncomfortable at all times.
Right, and we saw a lot of what they call mush rush against Boston College, which is more just kind of gap containment. And I really hope they just let them pin their ears back and come in this game, because that's when this defensive line is the most effective, and that's also what's going to lead to just kind of throwing Klubnik off his game. Now, obviously, you have to be careful because you got to watch out for Shipley on screens and stuff like that, because he's a very active back out of the backfield. Really, to me, Shipley's going to be your X factor here. Now, he doesn't have a touchdown this season, which is kind of strange, and Maffa's been kind of their red zone goal line guy there because he's their power back. But to me, the key to stopping this offense wholeheartedly is getting Klubnik off his kilter a little bit, but really it's just going to come down to stopping this running attack and these two backs.
I will say this as well. Clemson does a very, very good job in terms of perception as a program. Dabo talks about this all the time, the middle eight, and basically just talking about the perception that, last 4 minutes of the second quarter to the first 4 minutes of the third quarter, they want to make you pay in those situations. And you cannot, as a quarterback with Jordan, being an experienced quarterback like he is, you cannot have those mistakes as you go through, because Will Shipley is going to be able to pound the rock and being able to establish the run early on. And you look at it from last season's matchup. They were at 14-14. Jordan had a turnover on downs, field goal. Clemson's up 17-14. What do you look at? Jordan had a fumble the next possession over, and the next thing you know, Clemson goes right down the field and scores another touchdown. At that point, you're down 24-14 at that point. Clemson comes right back after the half, scores an easy touchdown, and you're up 31-14 at that point. And you're like, where did the time go? You were up 14-7 at one point, and then you let that game get out of control. You cannot be able to do that, especially in Clemson's home territory. And at that point, you just have to understand it comes back to the focus aspect. You have to understand what's at stake at this point. And Jordan has to understand that. Being a leader of this football team, you have to understand those mistakes cannot pile up, and you have to be the bigger team at this point and showcase your team that you are ready for this challenge.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. They were in that game last year, and that's really something that you've seen from Florida State over the past few years, from the 59-10 game down to last year. They've really incrementally closed that gap on the field. But last year, it just fell apart in about 2 to 3 minutes of bad football. And when you're playing a good team, you cannot make mistakes like they did last year. Now, is Clemson as good as they were last year? I don't really think so. But they're good enough that if you play like you did against Boston College, you're going to be in trouble, and you're at their place. If they get momentum, it may not be super packed in the first quarter as everybody's kind of filing in late. But if you let the crowd get into it in the second half and they end up getting a little bit of a lead and Florida State starts looking around, maybe second guessing like they did last week, you could find yourself in trouble. So I do think they need to come out and just play clean and really set the tone. And maybe, I'm not going to say they need to jump on them early, because I think these teams are both going to trade blows back and forth. And we know Florida State has been more of a second half team, but you got to stay in this game. You can't let Clemson get the momentum. So now talking about these two defenses, looking at Clemson, they have allowed 19.7 points per game this season so far. Florida State's at 22 points per game. Explosive plays allowed. Florida State has given up some explosive plays, 16 so far this season, which we know some of that happened in garbage time against LSU. Explosive plays by Clemson is only 8 allowed. So we'll have to see how that goes. Florida State likes explosive plays, and Clemson does not like to allow them. Third down defense are almost pretty much evenly matched here at 33.3 and 29.8. Red zone defense also both pretty close here, 72.7 for FSU, 66.7 for Clemson. Now, your pressure sacks and tackles for loss generated Florida State. Again, we're talking pretty even here, but the sack numbers are what stands out. And Florida State's been able to do a little bit better in the sack game there. Now, when you talk about this defense and talking about what I brought up earlier about adjusting for the FBS, this is one that to me really stands out. When you talk about they held Charleston Southern to only 74 yards, which is kind of unbelievable to even think about it. A team didn't even gain 100 yards against them. So when you look at their passing defense, it's currently 10th in the country, allowing 148 yards per game versus FBS only. And it's not exactly like they played two powerhouse FBS teams. That goes up to 193, which drops to 31st. Run defense is 98 yards per game, 35th. But against FBS teams, that jumps to 141 yards per game, down to 70th. When you look at the sacks, 4 total, 109th at 1.33 sacks per game, drops to 2 against FCS. Tackles for loss is the same story, 24 on the season, 23rd in the country. Against FBS, it's only 14, which is 46 in the country. So, again, they really feasted on that Charleston Southern team. But when you look at what they did against some not that great FBS teams in Duke, which Duke has a good offense. That's their strength, and they returned 99.5% of their yardage. So that's where they were able to hurt. But FAU's not a good offense. So I think that their defense, and this was something that we questioned when Venables left, was how could they carry on that success? And they still have a load of talent. They have 2 of the best linebackers in the country. They still have, more 5-stars on their defensive line than Florida State has on the entire team. This team is still loaded, but they've really not been able to put it together that well so far. And I really do feel like Florida State, the offense is, they got off to a couple slow starts in LSU and Southern Miss, and they maybe didn't do some things right last week. But if they can get right, if they can play good in this game and limit the mistakes, I think they have some opportunities here. I think your receivers are a mismatch on their secondary, even though their secondary is not terrible with guys like Sheridan Jones and things like that. They're not terrible, but I think you had the advantage there. The thing that worries me the most in this game when you talk about offense versus defense is can Florida State get the run game going? We've really seen them kind of struggle to run the ball. And while LSU has a good defensive line, when you talk about Mason Smith being out, this is probably the best defensive line you're going to face on your schedule. And so to me, the key on offense is going to be, can you get that run game going? And I really do think Jordan's going to have to use his legs in this game. He's just going to have to. And I know he hasn't really wanted to run a lot. And with the injury last week, he didn't run the ball, I don't believe at all after he got injured. So hopefully that's not a limiting factor in that game. But just kind of give me some thoughts on Florida State offense versus Clemson defense and what they got to do to get this run game going.
Yeah, so you kind of discussed a little bit of the issue with Jordan's legs. We had the same discussion last year, at that point. Everybody thought, man, Jordan's just being a pocket passer. He's just not really looking to scramble. It's the same situation as last year. But then when he played Clemson last year in last year's game, he was able to utilize his legs, gave Florida State a chance to be successful. There you go. So I think, as you stated, Jordan has to do what he has to do with his legs. I think that's going to be very important if he's healthy. Of course, he may be limited a little bit in terms of what he can do. But having those read option plays and being able to have an effect as legs, that would be great because, you look at it, Trey Benson. Everybody on FSU social media at this point is talking about Trey Benson. And, man, Rodney Hill needs to get more carries. And that may be the case because Rodney Hill does a tremendous job of being able to run through tackles, being able to run with aggression. And you're not really seeing that so far with Trey Benson as we've gone through. Maybe it's kind of an adjustment period, but it wasn't like you've seen from the second half of the season. Now, of course, you kind of look back at a different position from 2 seasons ago at this point with the Marion Cooper. He started, was able to kind of blossom himself into the second half of the season. Then the next season, he didn't really do as well as you thought he would at that point. So, I know the expectations are high for Trey Benson. I get it. He wants to be a 1,000-yard rusher. First time since Cam Akers did it. And he wants to be that guy and that featured guy for Florida State. I thought he was going to be that guy originally because Florida State loves to establish the run early and often. But, of course, with his struggles as he's going through, it just doesn't seem like he's running through tackles as physically as he should. Now, I know that he understands that. The criticism is always going to be there for him. He is his biggest critic at this point. But I do think if him and Rodney Hill and Keziah Holmes at that point are able to kind of generate a 3-headed monster at that point, along with Lawrence Toafili in the receiving game, a little bit more in the carries as well, I think it can be an effective weapon that Florida State can be able to use. But just as you talked about before with Trotter and Carter as well at linebacker, I think it's going to be something you're going to have to monitor. And then you got a guy like Xavier Thomas on the defensive end that I think has been at Clemson for since Jesus was born at that point. And he's been there for a while. So, of course, you have to think this defense is a little bit older in certain regards. But I think if Florida State's able to kind of mask some of those disruptions from Clemson's defense, I think it can be able to be successful if they give it the chance.
Yeah, he's like a Hunter Renfrow. I don't know like what Clemson does. I don't know if like they allow guys to play under a master's degree program or something, but man, those guys just stay forever. But I do agree. I mean, it almost feels like Jordan is out to prove a point, that he is a passer and not a runner. And I understand it because everybody questioned whether he could throw the ball, but at the same time, he is an elite runner and he is an elite scrambler, and it adds a different aspect to this offense that when you're playing a team like Clemson, you have to have. And so hopefully he's willing to run the ball some of this game. And I really because he's, like you said, he's deadly on the read option, and you're going to need that extra kind of gear from this offense. I hope to see Keziah Holmes a little bit more because Trey it sounds like everybody's ready to put Trey back in the portal. Yeah. And I just think that's silly. I mean, now I do see where you miss Trayshawn Ward this year. You miss that guy that can make you miss in a phone booth. He was a guy where you wouldn't see a hole, and then all of a sudden he springs it for 60 yards. Mm-hmm. You kind of see Trey dancing a little bit or just kind of putting his head down and running into tacklers and not breaking tackles like you mentioned. So it may be getting more guys in this rotation. But I think, you may be missing guys like Dylan Gibbons too, who was a really aggressive run blocker. But they're going to have to run the ball in this game, and that defensive line is no joke. I mean, Xavier Thomas has been injured his whole career. He hasn't played a lot, but this is a guy that's potential first-round NFL draft pick. And really, when you look at Clemson's defensive line as a whole, they're all NFL-type players. So you're going to have to bring it. But if Jordan is willing to run the ball, and you look at Duke put up 199 yards rushing on them. Riley Leonard had 98 yards rushing. They didn't sack him a single time because of his elusiveness. You really just need Jordan Travis to have the same type of game that Riley Leonard had against this Clemson defense. You need them to be able to move the ball with the quarterback if the backs can't get it done. I do think that you're going to be able to get some, I know everybody's kind of freaking out about Keon Coleman and the tweet and not getting targeted a lot, but it's just something in this game that we talked about preseason where you have so many weapons. There's only one football, and this is something Mike Norvell mentioned. There may be days where Jaheim Bell only gets one catch, where at least we saw Johnny Wilson have a bounce back game. He cleaned up a lot of the drops against BC, so it's nice that this is something we talked about too in the preseason, where you have two talented receivers now, where if someone has a struggle game, you could turn to the next guy and you could still have an effective weapon. So I think you are going to need to get those guys going. I think you're going to need to take a little bit of what this defense gives you. Don't force things, because this is not a bad defense by any means. They have a lot of talent, but I think you are going to have to run the ball to open some things up. And I think you're going to have to use Jordan's legs to open that run game if the backs can't get it done.
So I do have a question for you too, because I know we've talked about establishing the run and being a power football team in terms of just establishing the line of scrimmage. When you look at a guy like Demetri Emmanuel, and they had to come in and get Keandre Jones in there from Auburn, 325 pounds, 330 pounds at this point, he was a pivotal part in the LSU game with that. Now, you talk about the defensive line for Clemson having a lot of NFL bodies. Do you think it would be beneficial for Florida State to be able to insert him to the lineup and being able to generate that run game early and often in the game? Or do you think it would be okay for Emmanuel to kind of, take a step back and being able to still play in that starting role?
I do think now Emmanuel has size too. He's a massive dude, so I can't take that away from him. But I think you got to go with your bowling balls here. You got to go heavy. And what we've seen from Keandre Jones has been really positive. I mean, he's been a great blocker so far. I think you need to get him in there. It's just, like I said, I think when I look at this offensive line, I think you had a clear-cut leader last year in Dylan Gibbons. And this year, it just kind of seems to be a really quiet group with really no defined vocal leader. So I think maybe through the first 3 games, they've had a chance to play around with some guys. You also saw last week, like you mentioned earlier, Robert Scott was out. You saw Maurice Smith was out in that game. And now they only had one bad snap, which bounced your way, which was fortunate. Yeah. But I do think that they've been playing around with some guys to kind of get the lineup they want. But I do think getting Maurice Smith back, which is kind of your quarterback of that offensive line being at center, and he's an experienced guy. I think that will help. Robert Scott being back should help. And this is if they're back. We don't know that for sure because Florida State will list you on the depth chart and then definitely not play you. That's just the way they play. But I do think you need size against this line because these guys are massive. And really that's the strength of their defense is that front seven. And just as much as you want to establish a run with those guys, I think you also have to be able to give Jordan time because I think your biggest mismatch, like we talked about, is in the pass game. So you can't take advantage of that mismatch because I think it's really going to be a lot of your downfield passing that's going to be the key in this game. You can't do that if Jordan's running for his life. Now, we know he's a really good scrambler, but yeah, man, I really do think Keandre Jones has been a lifesaver for this team. And this is a guy that hopefully you get for multiple years. We know he's still kind of young, has SEC experience. So like he's not scared to get into big game situations. But yeah, I mean, I love the size that they have, but it just really hasn't been as dominant this year. Now, that's not to say they haven't been bad. Have been bad. I actually saw a stat earlier on Twitter where Florida State was at, I think, 4.1 yards before contact, which was like top 10 in offensive line. So the run push wasn't that great against Boston College, but I think a lot of it does kind of fall on the backs so far in this one. But yeah, I mean, I think that defensive line is going to be, this is one of those games where if you can block them, because we saw that against Duke. They could not block Clemson's defensive line. He ran for his life the entire night. A lot of theirs was just kind of making plays happen as he was running because that defensive line was giving him fits all night long. And that's something that Florida State in the past, that's what cost them this game a lot of times. They could not block that defensive line. And while it's not quite the guys that they had in the past, there's still a lot of talent. So you have to be able to block them first and foremost to be able to have success against Clemson. That is like the number one thing is being able to block that defensive line or else they're going to blow up the play in the backfield.
Yeah, I totally agree with that and everything. And I definitely think as well with that, you talked about Keon Coleman with having the lack of opportunities, but you have to kind of remember we have Jaheim Bell that is also kind of a Clemson. They used to be arch rivals with him at South Carolina at that point, and he's performed pretty well against South Carolina. Last year he had a touchdown against them at that point at South Carolina. I definitely think this could be an opportunity for him to continue that growth and development that he had before. He had 5 receptions for 76 yards and a touchdown. I think you can definitely be able to establish himself in the offense. And really, when you're looking at it, I mean, you have Keon Coleman, you have Johnny Wilson, you have Jaheim Bell. I think you have a lot of options there, but can you be able to generate that pressure? That's another thing that you have to kind of realize with that.
Yeah, and I'm sure Jaheim Bell has this game circled on his calendar because those two do not like each other. It's like Florida State. Like I live in South Carolina. I live outside of Charlotte, so I'm like in a mixture of Gamecock fans and Clemson fans, and like, we talk about wanting to win all these games and everything like that. I need this one, y'all. I need this win. It's been a long time living up here in Clemson territory. I work with Clemson fans. Man, I need something. Like I need to win this. I need them to win this game because it's been a drought and it's been tough. But talking about him having this game circled, I don't think anybody wants this game more than Mike Norvell. He's heard a lot of the stuff that's come out, with Dabo bashing Florida State and the way they kind of blew them out a few years and really just kind of didn't call the dogs off in the 59-10 game and things like that. To me, I think Mike Norvell has had this game circled for a long time because he knows they squandered the opportunity last year. I think like if he's got a list of names on his bedroom wall or something like that, Dabo's got to be at the top. He has to want this game more than anything. So, I feel like Mike Norvell is one of those guys that he doesn't acknowledge the noise from the outside, but he keeps a log of everything. So to me, what do you think? Like, give me some of your thoughts on that. Mike Norvell has to want this game more than anybody.
The COVID situation, that really stirred a little bit of fire there. And I get Florida State has kind of generated as a program. They've gotten a little bit better here and there. And like you said, last year was probably their best shot that they've had in quite some time to beat Clemson. And I think this is an opportunity for Florida State to kind of take advantage of that. You look at Mike Norvell on the sideline against LSU, where he was just, trying to do everything he could to generate that. I think it's very important with that so far.
Yeah, and really when you look at like the big games that Mike Norvell has played in, he's always ready for it. They upset North Carolina when they were a top 5 team. They were ready for that LSU game. They beat LSU last year. So I think that last week, a lot of people think, and myself included, that they kind of ran a vanilla game plan because they didn't want to show Clemson too much. But I think this is one where being that noise, being that kind of bad blood between these two programs and these two coaches and whatnot. And I know they won't acknowledge that, but we all know it's there. I think this is a pull out. This is an all gas, no brakes, pull out the stops in this game. You know, you could see like in the LSU game last year where maybe you run a reverse pass early in the game or something just to break it open. I think they really, really want this game more than anything because it really is like, you know, Clemson, I understand they lost to Duke. But like you said in the opening of the show, they are until they aren't. And until you knock them off the mountain, they're still the king of the ACC. And, you know, Florida State this was Clemson's conference for a long time. Then Florida State joined in 92, and Clemson didn't win an AC championship for, I think it was 19 years or something like that. So they came in and stole that conference, and the power has shifted back to Clemson. And you feel like this is the year that Florida State can get it done. But can they? Can they go out and do it in their backyard? And I really think that this is such a huge game for Florida State as a program to be able to say, like, I'm back. Because a lot of people said, okay, Florida State might be better this year, but you really think they're just going to grab some pieces out of the portal and go out and overtake Clemson? And, you know, it's hard. It's hard to beat a team like that in their place, but this is the year that it's got to happen. And, you know, like we've talked about before, they're going to lose some pieces next year. So you do get them at home. But I think if you're going to do it, if you're going to knock them off the mountaintop, it has to be right now.
Yeah, I hate to put a lot of pressure on the team just in terms of that, but it is so pivotal to be able to beat Clemson this year. I mean, like you said, I mean, Jordan's not going to be here this year. Johnny Wilson's probably not going to be. Keon Coleman. I mean, the list goes on and on of guys that are not going to be here next year. And this is the opportunity that Mike Norvell has been waiting for, what he's been preaching for in terms of being able to take the next step as a program. And I think it's just very important for Florida State to continue to generate that momentum as we go through the rest of the week and just kind of understand and emphasize to his team that you have to get this done. Because there's no playing Clemson in the ACC championship. You beat them, you knock them out of the ACC championship consideration, hopefully, and kind of knock them out of the water. And that way you can kind of focus on the next step as a program.
Yeah, definitely. And because I feel like if you drop this game, it's going to be, it's the same old Florida State. Like they beat LSU, who, by the way, LSU looks like the best team in the SEC right now. And so to me, that's another reason why you don't hit the panic alarm over the Boston College game is LSU looks really, really good right now. I mean, they blew out Mississippi State, who isn't, you know, a power, but they're a decent middle of the road SEC team. But, you know, again, I think it's just for the perception of the programs. If you drop this game, it's going to be the same old Florida State, this, that, and the other. And we have heard them come out in some of the post-practice interviews, and it is early in the week, that the intensity has been ramped up like it was against LSU for that week because they know how big this game is too. I mean, I don't think anybody in any way, shape, or form says, they're not top 25. We're just going to roll in there, and this isn't a big game. They know how big this game is, and they know how crucial it is to win for the program. So as we get ready to wrap up, I've prepared some keys to victory here, what I think Florida State needs to do to come out on top in this one. And so we'll go through those, and you can kind of share what you think about those and some of maybe your own. So looking at the keys to victory, we did talk about this already, is going to be contain the run. Shipley ran for 121 yards against Florida State last year. He is really their biggest offensive weapon, their most consistent offensive weapon. I think that is really the key to this game is going to be stopping that running attack with Will Shipley. I think the second key to the game is going to be rattling Cade Klubnik. He's been prone to mistakes, especially under pressure. When you look at some of his pressure numbers, his completion percentage is only 38.2%, only 3.7 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. We know that he's been a player that has gotten happy feet in the past. That's something that happened in the Orange Bowl against Tennessee. He's fumbled the ball a lot. So that's something, like we said, he got 5 turnovers in the first 3 games. So he can make mistakes if you can get to him. Now, on the flip side, I think it's interesting that he has been really good against the blitz. When you look at the numbers, and again, it's PFF, so we're going to have to take their stats with a grain of salt. But if what they say is correct, he's actually been better against the blitz than not blitzing. So I think it is going to be crucial for, like we talked about, for your defensive line to be able to come through in this game without blitzing a lot. And he's also tricky to get on the ground. Like we said, only 5.3% pressure to sack ratio, which was 10% against Duke. And then, of course, the last key that I have here is to limit mistakes. This really just feels like a game where who is the worst? I mean, when you look at both of these teams, they both have talent. They both have weapons on. The narrative so far for Clemson has been mistakes. the narrative for Florida State so far has been mistakes. Like if they play at their highest level, there's really not any team on the schedule that they can't beat. But we've seen those mistakes really kind of rear their head in some situations. And luckily they've been good enough to pull away from these teams. But Clemson did not overcome those mistakes and got blown out by Duke in the first game. So to me, this one is really just about who can make the less amount of mistakes, who can play the. And, I feel like Florida State's a little more battle tested, having played LSU, having had that challenge on the road where you had to kind of claw back to hold on late. Whereas, Clemson they were kind of out of that Duke game early, and then they just ran through two kind of nobody teams. So you're going to have a really big increase in competition coming up against Florida State. You're going to see a team that you have not seen yet this season, whereas Florida State has seen that. So to me, the nerves should be out the window if you can just play a clean game, limit that run, and kind of rattle Klubnik a little bit. I think you have a really good chance to win this game. So give me some of your thoughts on the keys that I have listed, and then some of your own keys to victory in this one.
Yeah, I definitely think Will Shipley is kind of the engine that could with this team at this point. I definitely think he is kind of the guy that you have to stop in this regard. It's great that you have Lovett back in this game and you're able to kind of save him for this game. I think it's very important. Klubnik, you got to get some pressure on him. You have to understand that. There's no more scheming around pass rushing schemes and everything else. You have to be able to get to him. You have to be able to rattle him and make sure that those short passes are no longer going to be there anymore. If you have to sit in the zone, that's okay as well. Just trying to find ways to make him feel uncomfortable, I think is very important there. And as you talked about before with the mistakes, Florida State's had many of those this season, specifically last week. And you have to figure out, and it's a good thing because you've already learned from that mistake. You're understanding that you cannot be able to do that week in and week out because you're going to get every team's best effort as you go through. And I want to add to this as well because we talked about this before with Florida State being more of a big yardage offense. They're not really taking what the defense gives them. And I think that's going to be very important in this game. You cannot force the issue downfield. If you're able to throw the ball away, that's great. But don't throw a lob pass up in double coverage. Being able to try to fit into tight windows, it's just not going to work. And the biggest thing that I come through with this is former offensive coordinator that's currently over there head coaching at Arizona State with Kenny Dillingham talked about it perfectly in a press conference that he had. Basically just talking about keeping the chains moving, getting ahead of the chains, making that 2nd and 7 rather than a 2nd and 12 or, a 2nd and 10, making sure you can go to 3rd and 3, 3rd and 2, making sure you can stay ahead of the chains. That way your Trey Bensons and your Jordan Travises and, your Rodney Hills, guys like that can be able to be effective and you're not having to have a 3rd and 8 with a crowd roaring in your face at that point. You need to make sure the offense can be able to maintain that. And also, on top of that, on the defensive side of the ball, if you're in a 3rd and 12 situation, 3rd and 11, being able to get pressure on Klubnik so that way he isn't able to get those 12, 13-yard pass plays, like you saw against Boston College. It was very frustrating. And
yes, it was.
With that, it hurts. With Florida State against Boston College, they were only 1 for 9 on 3rd down offensively. So really trying to be able to get back in those 3rd and manageables would be fantastic for this Florida State team as they kind of grow and develop in each other and understand to trust each other through that process.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point about staying ahead of the chains because if you get in a 3rd and long, an obvious passing situation, and you allow that defensive line and those linebackers to pin their ears and come at you, you could be in a bad situation because, again, we talked about that front 7 is the strength of our defense. So you need to stay ahead of the chains. And then you don't have to force things either. And we've seen Jordan do some uncharacteristic things this year where I think he tries to play hero ball and he tries to do a little bit too much at times. So like you said, you bring up a great point. I think you need to take what the defense gives you. I think in this game, points are going to be at a premium. So I think you need to capitalize on every opportunity you get. And you just, knowing that Clemson is a mistake-prone team, you need to do almost as little as you can while being successful. Don't force the issue. Don't do things that are going to cause you to make mistakes. Let them make the mistakes. Let them have the fumble and let you just play clean. Stick to your game plan, and don't lose focus and don't lose that intensity and your responsibility that you're supposed to do. Don't try and play hero ball and just kind of let the game come to you and be successful because we've seen this offense at a high level. They can move the ball on a really good defense, but it's when you start to see them force things like they did in the Boston College game, or just blown assignments or trying to not take the underneath routes, but force it to a guy in double coverage. that's when you start to run into mistakes. And we saw them snap their 35-point streak, which are still above 30, but we saw them snap that against a team that doesn't have a great defense. So I think you're going to have good weather. There's not going to be any issues there. You've been through that noon game preparation, so you should be in a good position for this game. And I really do think they're going to hopefully have a chip on their shoulder from hearing, that they've been terrible all week. So I hope they come out ready to play. And, getting into the end, I know you haven't put out your score yet, so I won't put you on the spot in this one, but I won't tell people what we talked about before the show. So, yeah. But you know what? At first I was just going to go with like who's going to win and who's not. But I will say before I show my score prediction, like I am confident and also a little worried about this game, just not so much because of the Boston College game, because teams have stinkers all the time. That is just part of football. We saw last year they played 3 bad games, which really the Clemson wasn't bad as a game. It was just a bad few minutes. But the NC State game and the Wake Forest game, you played terrible and you lost both of those. You played terrible against Boston College and you still won. So this team has gotten better. But I really just think it comes down to I don't think Clemson is as bad as people think they are. I think they are a much better challenge. But I like the way that Florida State matches up with them, as far as you being able to get pressure on their quarterback and you being able to take advantage of a secondary that's maybe not top tier. I just think it's going to come down to whether you can block them or not. So I feel really good that Florida State can go win this game. But I honestly feel more nervous about this game than I did the LSU game, just because it's in Death Valley. They don't lose up there a whole lot. But like I said, when you keep in mind, in the back of your mind, the noon games last year, they did lose to South Carolina. They did play tight against Syracuse, who Florida State blew out later in the season. I still think Florida State, it's not time to hit the panic button. I think they're going to be regrouped and have a new level of focus this week after the scare last week. And so I still have Florida State going up in there and winning this game. I'm taking the Noles over the Tigers, 34-24 to get it done in Death Valley, to snap that streak and to move to 4-0. And to me, this is something that I talked about last week after the postgame show. Everybody wanted to just cancel the season because of Boston College all of a sudden. If you go up there and you beat them in this game, no one's going to talk about Boston College. That game is going to be flushed with the quickness. Everyone will just be focused on this. So this is really a big-time redemption game. You also, something we haven't mentioned, you have a bye week next week. So you can really just let it all hang out and then have next week to get yourself right. So to me, it's no holds barred in this. It's all gas, no brakes. And to be honest, I don't see Florida State going up there and blowing Clemson out. I don't see that being a situation like maybe it happened with LSU. But let's just say they come out on fire and they do get ahead on Clemson. I think Mike Norvell is going to really try and stick it to Dabo and Clemson. So, we'll see. I think they're going to be ready for this one. So without giving a score prediction, you can go as in-depth or as tiptoe along the sideline as much as you want, how you think this one's going to play out in the end.
Yeah, I definitely think Florida State has the best chance in terms of being successful. You talked about it before. Why not us this year? Why not? We have to quit making excuses as a program at this point. This is the best year we have in terms of competing at a high level against them. And I think this is going to be the opportunity that Florida State desperately needs to make that perception as a program successful. And I definitely think that Jordan Travis is going to be ready for the challenge. Whether or not he makes those mistakes in the middle 8 and understands the severity of what's going on, because you do have those other teams on the docket of the schedule. Can Florida State be able to be like last year, where they get off the bye week after this time, being able to string together a combination of straight wins at that point? I think is going to be something to see, but we have to get through this game first. I think the coaching staff understands that, focusing up and understanding what's at stake. And I think Florida State can be able to get the job done if they set their mind to it.
Definitely. I agree. And like you said, you feel good that you had the veteran quarterback of the two. You had really a more veteran experienced team of the two going up there. They've already been tested in a big game. You have the bye week next week. And then coming off of that, maybe the back end of your schedule, you have like Pitt looks a lot worse than you thought. Virginia Tech looks to be falling apart a little bit. But Duke and Miami could be something there. Yeah. Florida at the Swamp looks a little bit harder than it is. But this is your only focus this week. There's no more looking ahead. Like I said, personally, I believe they got caught a little bit last week looking ahead to Clemson. So it's your sole focus. And like you said, if not now, when? And I think this is the year that Florida State does get it done. I don't think it's going to be just go up there and run them out of the stadium. I think it's going to be a hard-fought game. I think Clemson's going to be ready because I'm sure they have to feel disrespected too, being outside of the top 25 and, a team that they beat for 7 times in a row, hasn't won up there in a long time. I think they're going to be confident too, and they're going to be ready to prove something too, because, like we talked about with Florida State beating Clemson, you now look past that Boston College game. If they beat Florida State, then I think the Duke loss, I mean, it doesn't get washed away, but I think you can look past that now. I think this is a get-right game for them as well. So I think there's a lot on the line. This is kind of like the battle for the top of the ACC mountain, even if, who knows, Duke or UNC or someone might be a challenger this year. But like I said, I think LSU is the biggest game. This feels like the most important game on your schedule by far. And I really hope they pull it off, and I'm excited. Now, the noon game is a little, takes a little bit of the wind out of your sails as far as the big environment, but I think it's an advantage for Florida State. So we'll see how it plays out on Saturday, but, I think they can do it. So any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Nothing much, man. I'm super excited to see how this kind of plays out, but we'll just definitely have to see. Mark Novel is going to have to be ready for this and everything, and he has to understand the challenges that are in front of him.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of a lot of big games on Saturday. It's going to be a treat of a Saturday to watch some football, and I think as long as Florida State sticks to their game plan and they get aggressive, even you saw in like the Colorado game the other night, which I was like, would someone just win? I'm ready to go to bed. Yeah. But you saw Colorado State had played aggressive and they had success, and then they went soft and allowed them to get back in it. So I think Florida State really just needs to stick to what they know, stay aggressive, stay on the gas, and they'll be able to get things done. But it's going to be a big one, and we'll be back with you guys after this is over. Hopefully, everything going well. I'll be at home for this game. I live close to the game, but I'm not going to go because I would like to do a post-game show. And it's like I said for the LSU game, like I'm a man of honor. I'm going to be here one way or the other. Hopefully, we're celebrating a win and not an upset loss. Yeah. But again, I don't think it's time to panic after the Boston College game. And if they can go up there and get this win, I think all will be right in the world. So with that being said, guys, I appreciate you tuning into this. I appreciate you guys' support throughout the year. Norvell Central, Taylor, let them know where they can find you because, again, like I always say, like the Jalen Ramsey video, if you ain't following Norvell Central, what are you doing? So much coverage, so much great coverage. Tell them where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can follow me at Norvell Central on Instagram as well, on Twitter or X, whichever one you want to call it. Central Norvell is where you can find me on there. I'm also on Facebook as well. Most of the time I typically do Instagram and Twitter, but you can find me on Facebook as well. I try to put out as much content as I can. I also write for Chop Chat, an article. It's a fan-sided site. If you want to go check that out, you can as well. We do a lot of different content on there. Trying to get as many subscribers and viewers as we can on those sites and just trying to get out as much content as I can, like you said before. But I know he has done a tremendous job on his content as well. We're all a family here at the end of the day. We want to see Florida State football be successful, and that's what we're all here for at the end of the day.
Most definitely. It's fun to be a part of the ride, even though sometimes that ride causes some chest pain and some trouble breathing on Saturdays. I wasn't sure if I needed to reach for the aspirin bottle or not because, like, man, that was more stressful than it needed to be. So hopefully this turns into an LSU type game where it's like you're not so stressed later in the game. But, I feel like it's going to be a good one. But, again, guys, go follow Norvell Central on his social media platforms. I promise you will love the coverage that he brings you. Check us out, plantthespear.com, for all of our coverage. I just dropped a little Florida State Clemson hype video for this game to get you pumped up because I'm super excited for this one. I can't wait. Like I said, I live in Clemson land, so all I see is orange and white all day long. And, man, I've been waiting 10 years to run my mouth to these guys. And so I'm just waiting. So, Florida State, please give me some ammunition on Saturday. I need it. But, again, guys, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you after the game. As always, thank you for listening, and go Noles.
Go Noles.